Welcome to More Than a Refresh. Today, we are recording from Astoria, Queens, Las Cruces, New Mexico, and Denver-ish, Colorado. Our guest is Leta Keane.
Kane.
Kane, it is Kane. Okay, Leta Keane. Would you do me so kind as to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello. I'm Leta Kane. My pronouns are they, them, and she, her. I live in the Denver area, and I've been in tech for about 7 years, mostly working with a nonprofit school for adults changing careers into technology. Due to layoffs, I'm now back in the job hunt and experiencing all the joys and pains that come with that. It's 2023. There's been a lot of changes and upheavals in our industry, so it's been really interesting getting a firsthand experience in some of those changes.
Well, hopefully we can help you with that with a little exposure. You and I met, I believe it was in 2023 at the Silicon Valley Postgres Conference, correct?
That's correct.
And we had you give a keynote. What was that keynote on?
Yeah, the keynote that I gave, and again, thank you so much for inviting me to be that speaker,
You're
was
welcome.
really about having a mindset of curiosity and learning in our teams, and really encouraging a rookie mindset and ways that we can encourage beginners and get out of some of the toxicity that can occur when we really prize expertise over curiosity.
And that's an interesting sentence. Can you elaborate on that? Valuing expertise over curiosity.
Yeah, of course. For me, what I mean when I say that, it's really kind of this, the friction between growth mindset and fixed mindset. Expertise in and of itself, not bad. Having a strong knowledge base, having deep experience, those are all excellent things. The issue comes when we start equating knowledge with rightness and as being better or more valuable than growth and learning. And I think I see it a lot, especially in the current job market, where junior developers are having a hard time getting a foothold. That's never been unusual, but especially in a time right now where we have so many great mid-level devs and senior level devs who are also looking for work, and seeing a lot of teams get a pretty top heavy, it can be really easy to lose sight of all the benefit of potential and of the curiosity, the ability to grow, the ability to be coached, the ability to learn of junior developers.
That's an interesting statement. I experienced this. Command prompt, we tend to hire, uh, not always. I mean, sometimes there's just client demand and we must have a senior person.
Of
Don't have
course.
time to build up a junior level dev. But I just had an executive panel with there's an offshore company in Chicago that invited me to an executive panel. They're trying to understand some of the gaps that they're seeing in the workforce. And it comes along the lines of what you're saying, in that they're finding that placing senior level devs or mid level devs is easy, but the junior level devs, it's harder. And one of the things that I said, and I believe this to the core, it's because companies have forgotten that investing in people is always cheaper. It is, and your return on investment is always higher. Okay, let's say 95% cheaper, 95% higher. There's always an exception. There's always some dumbass you hire that just refuses to work.
Yeah.
But
And that happens at any level, right?
yeah, at any
Any
level.
dev can roll in and do that.
Yeah, and that is very true. But what I said is that, we have forgotten to invest in our own people. And so you have this situation where it makes more sense to pay, let's say, $50,000 a year more, because you think in your mind, well, now I'm going to get another $500,000 a year in return on investment. But in reality, what you're doing is, instead of, maybe in the short run, you get that $500,000. But from a junior dev perspective, it's a bell curve, right? And so it comes up, and then after, say, year two, maybe the first year your return on investment is break even. Your second year is, let's call it 25%. But the third year is 300, 400%. And it's more than just their billable hours. It's more than just how quickly can they MVP. It's more than just you know, the fact that you get to hire them at a lower salary initially. It's that you're taking a holistic view. They are not assets, they are not resources, they are humans. And when you invest in a human and you invest in a person, generally speaking, the return on investment is so much higher over time than if you look at it as I need a senior level asset.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that that mindset is, like you said, very often lost. And that you're absolutely right. Recognizing that workers, developers, they are whole people with the ability to grow and develop with, you know, very, very almost unlimited potential. And I think another thing that drives this idea of like, well, we could hire three juniors or we could hire one senior, knowing that the senior is going to be able to spin up really fast. I think the flaw in that logic is the work that we do is collaborative. You know, there's a reason we don't have solo rock star developers as like the only dev on the team anymore. The tech has gotten too complex. The systems that we build are much bigger. The problems we solve are much more novel. And we are better and stronger teams when we are able to work collaboratively. And so hiring one strong developer ultimately is going to be a short gain in a short amount of time. But in a long term, I think you're setting yourself up for tech debt and difficulties with maintainability and things like that. Uh, Whereas spreading out the load and really leaning on this concept of community in our teams is a much better play.
I have to challenge you a bit. I haven't seen a single problem in the last 32 years of this industry that has been novel and not solved before.
I can see that point too. By novel problem, I don't mean like, oh, no one's ever encountered this before. By novel, I mean the fact that the context in which we work is constantly shifting and constantly changing. And nothing we do is in an island. You know, everything we do, the context of our users changes, the technology and frameworks that they're used to, the hardware that they use, all of it is constantly in a state of flux, which means, yes, there are patterns that we've seen before, and we leverage those to build wisdom and to build experience and to help us chart forward. But at every moment, you know, no moment that has come or that comes to us has ever happened before, which means the context is new every time. And we can use our past wisdom, but everything that we're doing, the world is constantly changing, our teams are constantly changing, the tech is constantly developing. And so, in some ways, the problems are always fresh, even if the patterns they follow are familiar.
That's well interesting. I would say, especially if you're bringing on junior developers, because they're not problems they have seen before.
Sure. Yeah.
Before we get too deep into some of this, let's talk about your career trajectory. It's been pretty nonlinear. You mentioned where you were before you were recently laid off,
Hmm.
um, and I have my own opinions on people that lay off. But what did you do prior to working in tech?
Yeah. Perennial question. Uh, I think that my background, which is very nonlinear, as you said, um, you know, has reflected more and more of developers' backgrounds. You know, I think there's more and more developers who don't go through that traditional CS degree, working on it, you know, learning code from elementary school onward that we're seeing with a lot of young developers, which is great. My background, my undergraduate degree back in 2009 was in creative writing and also world religions, dual major, neither of which leads to a particularly clear career. Uh, After that, I had a series of course, retail work. I worked, my very first job out of college was working as a portrait photographer at Sears, and then I became a pediatric dental assistant for a while. I did my fair share of food service and retail work. I eventually found work freelance as a SEO copywriter, and that's search engine optimization, as I'm sure most of your audience is aware, for a small web design team here in Colorado. And that kind of was the gateway that got me sort of marginally aware of tech. After that, though, I worked at a science museum for several years, first in a gift shop, then in one of the laboratories, uh, running biology and doing inquiry-based science education for museum guests. And I did that for about 4 years. It was great. I loved the environment. I loved the focus on learning. But, you know, museums, nonprofit, not necessarily the best wages, although the work was very fulfilling. I started looking around and I was aware of tech. And there was a nonprofit code school right in town that would, in less than a year, get me job ready as a junior developer. So I ended up was very suspicious. There's a lot of things that sound too good to be true. So I did a lot of research. I shadowed a class. I attended several workshops. I bombarded the instructors with tons of questions. I eventually enrolled, went through that program, and I was getting ready to graduate, starting to do some interviews, when a position opened up on the front end instructional team. And throughout the whole time at the school, I had been doing lots of volunteering with workshops, working as a TA, leading student led study groups, writing lots of spike lessons for the student body and things like that. And they were like, this one's a big nerd. This one likes teaching. So maybe we'll see if this one wants to come on out to the staff. And so I interviewed and did that for 6 years and was recently laid off at the end of October. But since then, been back on the job hunt, really looking into civic tech. But 19-year-old me would never have expected that I would ever be a developer. Uh, it's probably not something I'll do forever. It's been a great career so far, but I'm definitely not one to stay in the same industry for 30 years. So,
Fair enough.
yeah.
I have young, well, I mean, they're adults, but young kids. And two of my kids, 20 and 18, my girls, I have always told them, whatever you get your degree in, your passion is your minor. Your ability to get a job is your major. Your parents failed you with world religion and what was the other one?
Creative writing.
Creative writing. Now, both, I am not knocking those degrees. That's a fantastic, well-rounded degree. Having an understanding of religion in how it applies to society throughout cultures, throughout time, I think is vastly important to the improvement of society. Creative writing, I've never been very good at, but I certainly enjoy a fiction novel or story. However, as you experienced, not necessarily career defining debt.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I just find it, to ask a 17, 18-year-old to make a decision about that when most of us haven't really experienced a lot of what jobs are even out there. I had no idea that software developer was a thing. I had no idea that, optometrist was on the table. I had no idea that there were so many different, fascinating, exciting roles. I'm sure, like many people, I grew up in a household and a culture that expected college as a default. That was just what you
sure.
did. And, I even even way back to when I was a kid, the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? I never had an answer. I just enjoyed most things, which is how I ended up with my degrees because they gave me a lot of room to take tons of different subjects outside of my focuses. So I took like ornithology and history of the American frontier and like tons and tons of different classes. Uh, and religion classes were fascinating because they were sociology and art and history and literature all rolled into one degree. And so that's how I ended up with my not very feasible, career choices for degrees because really what I enjoyed most was just wide learning and just learning as much as I could. And that's always been my strength and my weakness is omnivorous curiosity. In a world that really wants you to have a particular focus and direction, I struggled. I struggled for sure.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I fell into what I do. I mean, when someone said, what do you want to do for your living? I was like, I either lawyer or architect. And then I didn't finish school. So that blew both of those out of the water. And I, ended up working at a bookstore and ended up managing the computer book section. And this was
Mm,
back when, computers, although not new, were very expensive, reasonably slow, all proprietary. Um, and I just started, sponging all of that information. I ended up where I am today. Um, do you think that, you were at the Turing School for 6 years
mhm.
and as an instructor. Now, this is going to sound weird. I have no doubt that you have reached senior level instructor status for junior level knowledge, because that's what the tutoring school would do, right?
Yeah.
Do you feel that your senior level knowledge has expanded? Well, for example, I mean, would you feel transparently honest in saying, "Hey, I'm a mid-level dev. I've been teaching for the last 6 years."
Yeah, I would definitely consider myself it's an interesting thing, and it's a thing that the instructors we would always discuss is like how marketable are we? Are we shooting ourselves in the foot career-wise by staying on and teaching rather than going out and being devs? Especially those of us who went straight from student to instructor, which there were a few, fewer over time, but there were some of us, and that is something that we would often discuss. Um, yeah. I mean, transparently, I feel like I have a really great understanding of code. I have a really great understanding of working collaboratively. I feel like I have got very strong skills in conducting code reviews, in receiving code reviews, all of those professional skills. The main uh, points that I feel the weakest in are working in large code bases and like dev ops type things, deployment, that sort of thing, because I don't have a ton of experience with it. Um, that being said, those are skills that are needed. And so I feel like I'm definitely not fit to be a senior because you need someone who is comfortable with those technologies, who can kind of lead the way. But I feel like I would make a very solid advanced junior or uh, entry mid level developer. But I mean, it really requires a lot of work and a lot of self motivation to keep those skills sharp, to keep finding new technologies, to continue learning, to continue to stay up to date so that our curriculum could stay up to date. And it is a challenge when you're an instructor. A lot of us are soft hearts who
Yeah,
want to give a lot to our students who are doing something that is incredibly challenging. And it's very easy to fall into the trap of giving all of your time to that and not reserving any time for your own professional development. And it was an ongoing struggle.
sure. You know, you just said something. First, let's actually, why before I get into this, why did you study to become a front end engineer and then pivot to teaching? Was it you fell into it, or because you mentioned earlier that that's what happened? But what was the decision pattern for that pivot?
Yeah. So for the pivot from front end, so one of the reasons I did front end because the Turing School has a back end program and a front end program. I really actually enjoy back end work quite a lot. I love systems thinking. I really enjoy organizing data. The act of writing queries to be very efficient is like, ooh, I love that. I can do that for hours. But one of the reasons I pivoted to front end is because I think the part where I come alive is the process of making good data accessible, digestible, and available for the end user to make informed decisions and so that the end user can connect to opportunities, resources, information that they would otherwise maybe not have access to. And so that layer of that human interaction and making these tools useful and usable is really, I think, where my heart lives. That service area, and so that's where front end, there's something to be said that that bleeds into back end as well, but that layer of the interaction and the interfaces, that's what I really enjoy. From teaching, working at the museum, doing a lot of science inquiry education, always loved that. I really love helping people connect to concepts and ideas that they maybe find a little bit daunting, but being able to grab onto it, challenge themselves to be uncomfortable, to work through that process, the discomfort of not knowing, to like work toward knowing, but also knowing that the knowledge is not the end goal. The understanding and the patterns that you use to get to places of understanding, that's what's important and valuable. And that process is very fulfilling for me. And I feel like something I very much enjoy. So I think that's been the source of the pivot. And going through that process myself is really what drove me to find joy in helping others through that process too.
That's a great topic to talk about there. That knowledge is not the goal. So let's talk about math. Okay, just for a brief second.
Yeah.
If I say to you, the answer is 5, but I don't tell you how to, if I don't help you understand how to get there, the fact that the answer is 5 doesn't really mean all that much,
Yeah.
because it could be 1 plus 4, 3 plus 2, any number of fractions times fractions,
Mhm.
right? And it's the understanding of how you got to 5 that actually matters, because the knowledge is the result.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. It's something like, I see this a lot with junior developers memorizing sorting algorithms, just memorizing the answer, because they know it comes up in some interviews sometimes. Uh, and like, great, when you run into that particular algorithm, yes, you'll have the answer to give. But that says nothing about your skills. It says nothing about your ability to break down a problem. It doesn't tell me anything about your ability to research and ask questions and work through problems and really, write code, try things, read your error messages, all of those processes that are necessary to the work. But just having and memorizing the answer so that when somebody asks you the question, you'll know the answer, that's satisfying. It's easy. It's really seductive. Uh, and that what you just said, like, if I look at this problem and I just am told the answer is 5, but I don't understand why the answer is 5, I'll know that the answer is 5 to that question forever. But as soon as I'm confronted with 6 minus 1, the answer is also 5, but I won't know how to get there.
Right.
So the process, yeah, that's one of the reasons it's so easy, especially for early learners and especially for people who've been raised in fixed mindset. The comfort that we give ourselves to prove that, oh, I can do this, I'm worthwhile, is look at this big pile of facts that I know. Look at my accumulated worth. This is how much I can do this and how much you should hire me, because it's easy to measure. And a lot of times when we're hiring, that's what we look at. We're like, well, what's your accumulated stack of knowledge? Because it's much harder for both the person presenting and the person trying to assess. Here are my tools. Here are the tools that I have that allow me to learn whatever you give me. It's one thing to say, here's my stack of knowledge, give me, this is my worth. To say, here's my stack of knowledge. It's not limited. This is not over. Here are the tools I use to build this stack so far, just as proof that the tools are good. And it's hard to do. It's hard to assess. It's hard to evaluate. It's hard to present. And that's one of the reasons why with fixed mindset, we learn in school. And by the way, fixed mindset is this idea that we have traits and they're on or off. We're either smart or we're not. We're good at remembering people's names or we're not. We're good at coding and design thinking or we're not. Whereas growth mindset is this idea that with sustained effort, practice, we can always improve in things. Not to say that it's our fault if we're not good at things. It's just that we can always improve, maybe not become great at things, but there is opportunity for growth and we're not static. So I know that you know that, but
No, I,
it's
I
always
was
good
going to
to
call
define
you
these
out if you
terms.
didn't bring that part up. So I'm glad you did.
Yeah.
The reality is, as an employer, I am in constant search for people who know how to solve problems. Schools don't generally teach that.
No, heuristics is very much not a thing that
Yeah.
is taught
And
explicitly anyway.
to become a comprehensive value to an organization, you have to be able to solve problems, because the method of solving problems is not, now some of the actions you might take are different, but the method of solving a problem, out of disk space, why are you out of disk space, the why, okay, is no different than why are you angry, why are you stubborn, what is the wall that you're not willing to overcome personally or in your relationship or whatever. It's all this, the methodology is the same. You have to peel it back, find the base, and work up. Now, as you get more experienced, certainly you look at an error message, or my partner responded this way and therefore I know I'm being an asshole. Okay, but as you get more experience, you can have some relative assumed responses for a more efficient success. But again, you have to start down here and
Mhm.
say, okay, our problem's up here, but this is not where it started. It never is. It
No.
never is. There's always, it doesn't matter if it's software or relationships.
Yep.
So I'm really glad you touched on that. And I'm really glad that you touched on the fact that, sure, well, and here's a good example. Um, math, I'll go back to math just because everything we kind of start with goes with math because we're in the tech field. I am very good at business math. Like, boom, okay, business math. You put calculus in front of me, and the first thing I say is there's too many parentheses. I don't even want to bother. That doesn't mean I couldn't figure it out. It's
Yeah.
just for me, there's just no return on investment,
Yeah.
right? However, if schools would teach how to solve problems as a core like skill set, right? It's where everything starts. Improving on reading, improving on comprehension, improving on math, improving on woodshop, personal finance, whatever.
Hmm.
The world as a whole, and especially I tend to be a little US centric, but our society would be better. And
Oh, I agree.
all right, so the second part of this, for our listeners, some of you may be tired of this subject. It is uh, a subject that has gotten a lot of publicity over the past few years. But I do encourage you to listen because, as you know, we have had Dr. Loran Starr on this podcast multiple times about this subject. And she is a literal expert, like PhD in this subject. And it's an important subject because a lot of us, because of media on all sides, are getting polarized and centered on them versus us. When if we want to be truly great as a society, it's not them versus us, it's all of us together growing and embracing uh, the gifts and the beauty thereof. For those of you who, most of you know, I'm a nomad most of the time, and we're in the nomad community. And one of the things that we do, that project that I'm working on has just announced, is we call it the Creatives Community Partnership. And nomads are largely feral people, and I mean we are. I mean, there's quite a bit of effort that I put into being as reasonably civil as I can be. But there's a beauty in that, in being feral. You are not being bound by corporatists, because that is what defines our society, is corporatists. And being able to break out from that and to find your own beauty and your own creativity and find success in that is better for society as a whole. Now, with that speech out of the way, we are going to talk about the infamous DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is really an important topic, and I think that Leta can provide some insight from a younger perspective versus, say, Loran Starr and I, who are not old, but certainly not young. Okay, we groan when we crawl out of bed, even when we weren't drinking too much, right? So let's start with our this is a solid question. What are the greatest barriers to entry for minorities in tech?
So I'll preface this by saying that, I don't have any formal studies in this. What I'm basing my answers are observations of hundreds of students that I've taught who've all attempted to find work as developers, a fairly diverse student body in terms of race, gender, and especially background, getting into tech. And also my own lived experience as a queer, non-binary person of color in tech. So please take everything I say with a grain of salt. I definitely tend to speak in generalities, but I never mean them. I'm a big fan of the particularity and the fact that everything depends on context. So Greatest barriers to entry for minorities in tech. I think that our barriers have lowered. The barriers to entry in recent years. I think they're maybe tightening up a little bit right now, again, just with the uncertainty of the market. But I think for a long time, there was a period uh, in the last few years where we saw bootcamp grads were getting hired more often. The need for a CS degree, the need to understand core CS theoretical concepts was starting to fade away. We started to see more interview processes that were less whiteboard this sorting algorithm and more sit down with a developer from our team and approach this ticket. What are how would you approach this code base? How would you start going about solving this problem? Which is much more reflective of the day-to-day work that would be done, and prioritize things like collaboration, communication, all of those pieces that are really critical for a healthy team that can work well together and solve problems well together. Uh, and so in those ways, I think there have been lots of really great efforts at lowering barriers for anyone coming in, which is really heartening to see. I think one of the bigger issues that tech has faced and is still facing, and it's not to say there are no barriers anymore, but I think the bigger issue that I see is retention of diverse teams, teams that have not just diversity of thought, which is a phrase I see get used a lot in the tech community, but diversity of race, culture, lived experience, the way that we move through the world, the way that the world reacts to us in it. I think what happens is we do a lot of work on the front to bring in candidates who, look different from us, think different from us, have different backgrounds from us. But we don't do a lot to analyze the assumptions that we make in our teams, the processes that are in place in our organizations, which are born under certain norms, certain biases that haven't been examined. And so bringing people in, bringing diverse workers into an environment where they are still considered the additional workers, the extra workers, the new and fun and different workers, still ends up causing a lot of harm. And I don't have numbers for this or a particular study to cite, but just anecdotally from speaking with the particularly like people of color in tech that I know, there's just a lot of extra cognitive load for non-white developers and non-Asian developers, because let's be real,
Yeah, I
Asian
was going to
developers
say we
are
need
not
to.
minority. But specifically Black, Latino, or Latinx and Indigenous workers in tech, very, very end up having a lot of additional burdens on top of their technical work.
So
So, yeah.
let's drill down on that.
Mm-hmm.
You say processes are biased based on the essentially the people that put them in place.
Not even, I'm not saying like maliciously biased.
No, I'm not suggesting
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I mean every person, and let's be clear. I mean,
It's just the air we breathe. It's the water we swim
cultures
in. It's,
tend
what we're raised
to
in.
yeah, exactly. Cultures tend to be their own melting pot,
Mm-hmm.
and they have their own rules and regulations of interaction and the whole bit. So certainly, if we're talking about a team that was put together over 10 years and the team is all white or primarily white and Asian, those processes are going to have a certain mindset.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, and let me be clear, I think that we should always be open to growth, which is what we're talking about here. So we shouldn't just shut down someone saying, well, have we tried X? But on the other hand, there is certainly a level of success that has been achieved, and we may have better things to do than listen to junior new African American or an indigenous developer question all of the hard work and effort we've already done. So how do we handle that problem? Because you never want to shut down someone being inquisitive, but
Mm-hmm.
on the other hand, you also do have to focus them. We're talking about employers here, and employers They can be the best employer in the world, but when it boils down to it, our jobs are not profit. That's a side effect. Our job is to make sure that we are responsible for feeding the families that we employ. Period. The end.
Mm-hmm.
Now, hopefully that's done with profit, right? Otherwise, you get bad management making bad decisions, laying off a bunch of people, like you see every damn year through an acquisition.
Yep.
Okay. But how do we handle that? How do we handle that bias? And can you give me I mean, I know it's anecdotal because, and I'm just picking on you a little bit.
No,
You're a
I get it.
teacher. You're a teacher. You're not in the workplace, right?
Mm-hmm.
Teachers are different. They have a different mind. They're trying to encourage the growth and build of a student. You're not necessarily dealing with the day to day of actually trying to get shit done.
Mm-hmm.
So, elaborate a bit for us.
Yeah, for sure. Uh, I think to answer your question about, how do we listen, but realistically, the business has to keep moving on. The way that things have worked have been successful. It takes time and resources that we don't necessarily have on our teams in order to tinker with that, which may have a negative return on an investment, may have no return on an investment, like no negative one, but no positive one either. So that's still maybe a waste of resources. There's no guarantee. Do we change up everything about how we do just for a few new employees? I mean, ultimately, I think this is one of the reasons that the status quo is the status quo, static, unchanging, fixed. It has its own inertia and momentum. I'm going to go a little bit off the rails here
No,
because
please.
in my late 30s here, I've become more and more of the ways in which workers are exploited. I've become uh, much more explicitly anti-capitalist in my late 30s here. I've become more radical than rather than less radical, like my parents told me would happen. Um, but I would say that uh, in capitalism, which is undoubtedly the system with which, especially American employment operates under, um, the drive is always growth or at least maintaining, although maintenance is still considered bad. It's considered stagnation. There is also a built-in sense of urgency that we don't have time for things, that we have scarcity, that there is not time to dedicate to these other pursuits that aren't necessarily directly driving the bottom line. And to your point, there is a degree of that. We want to make sure that our employees are gainfully employed, that their families are able to have food, have shelter, have a little bit of luxury, because that is a right, not just a nice to have when you're a human being. And at the
Wait,
same time, yes,
wait. Luxury is not a right. It's a
yes, it
privilege.
is.
It's a privilege.
But what I mean by luxury is not a yacht, it's
So, what
not
is luxury?
marble countertops. What I mean by luxury is anything above and beyond survival needs.
Give me
That's a family
concrete example.
pet, a family pet. Nobody needs a pet. Pets enrich our lives. I would say that, a family or a child that wants a pet but is unable to have one for financial reasons, that is a tangible loss. And I think that is terrible. Art is a luxury. Music is a luxury. The ability to have time to take care of your sick kid, that's a luxury. That is something that is not just, I guess that last one falls under like a right for anyone's count. But that's also a right that most people in our country don't have. Most of us are tied to jobs that do not afford us dignity or comfort in life. Comfort, I think about things, if you look at uh, food banks, if you think about what you donate to a food bank, most of us are donating the weird gray asparagus tips canned in water that have been sitting in our pantry, because I don't want to eat that, but why would we expect that someone who's in need also wants to eat that? Yeah, it's healthy, it's good, it's nourishment, but is it good? Does it provide satisfaction? Does it provide relief? So that's what I mean by luxury. I don't mean excess. I mean things that are outside the strict algebra of survival, things that make life worthwhile, things that help us build connection to each other, things that bring us comfort and satisfaction. That is not just, well, you're alive, so why are you complaining? To me, that mindset is really dangerous. And I feel like, never mind. I was going to say a broad generalization about a lot of employers feel like their only goal is to provide survival and no more, and that anything else uh, is like not their responsibility. And maybe it isn't. Maybe it should be. Maybe there are employers who decide that it is their responsibility. I
I,
don't know. I don't have all the answers.
I think so. So for command prompt, and this is why we're not some big megacorp. We have a
Hmm.
certain culture and ethos. We don't take private equity because private equity are they're vultures. One of our number one competitors has done equitable rounds year over year over year, and their shareholders will likely never make back what has been invested in because of that demonstrable earthquake of just damage that they're causing without people realizing
Right.
it. I want to back up a little bit because you touched on a lot of things. Um, I think that I know that I generally agree with you just because of my own ethos. But I also think that our lines are probably a little different.
Sure.
I was a Gen Xer, which means I essentially raised myself. So damn it, why can't you?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that I'm not open to or sensitive to some of the more interesting sociological problems that we have with current generations, not the least of which is the documented, scientifically studied damage that social media causes, especially to young women.
Hmm.
Um, but I think we need to bring it back a little. Let because we kind of dived off in this
Tie it a little more
my
to
yeah
tech.
the well no I think that's important because one, tech is not unique. This
Exactly.
problem exists across all paradigms, and I will give you a
Yeah.
perfect example. If I went to go be a kindergarten teacher, I would be called a pervert. Period. The end.
Yeah.
Okay. There's not a lot of male nurses, and there's many reasons for that.
Hmm.
Not the least of which it's not considered a masculine field, or two, uh, a lot of guys aren't as nurturing as a nurse should be. Okay, not
Or
saying we
weren't,
can't be. I'm just
yeah,
saying,
we're never raised or expected to
yeah,
be
that's
nurturing.
exactly right. Um, so this is more than about tech. A lot of people, and just like there's not a lot of female plumbers. Okay, there's not a lot of
Hmm.
female garbage workers or even electricians for that matter.
Hmm.
Um, and tech kind of gets poked a lot. Why? Because if you're halfway decent in tech, it is a generally easy. I didn't say it doesn't take effort, or
Right.
simple's a better word. The ladder to climb is simple to make a good living in tech. That doesn't mean there's not burn and churn. It doesn't mean that there aren't good employers and bad employers. But I do think tech gets a bad name in this problem because what we have done, and even our president has said, he was questioned, what do you tell a 50-year-old that has just gotten laid off because of transitions in their market? He said, learn to code. Clearly, on that specific issue, I invite our president to get his old ass up and learn to code because at 50 years old, it's not easy. Not impossible, but it is not simple and it is not easy, especially if you were a plumber for 40 years or 30 years. Okay. Um, so I do think tech gets a bad rap because what it essentially is that you're saying African Americans, which by the way, generally speaking, represent about 15% of the population, about 7.5% of them are in tech as of 2021. Now, some people would say that's a terrible statistic. Well, it actually isn't because if you consider where the concentration of African Americans live, there's not a lot of tech. Okay. So if you look at it holistically, the challenges are more than how do we get a particular culture or race to be more represented in a market. I think it has to go back all the way to elementary and middle school. Forget high school. Elementary and middle school. we are investing the wrong money in the wrong places to produce a positive result for disadvantaged youth to be able to achieve in tech or any other STEM field, because we don't teach them what? How to problem solve.
Yeah. The thing is, something I think about from my time working at the Science Museum, studies have shown that by the age of 6, it might be 7, but 6 or 7, by like, that's second or third grade. That's not very old. By that age, kids have already decided, based on the opinions and the responses of the adults around them, whether or not they are good at science. It's that early. There are studies that show when, you know, when young boys mess up on a math problem, people tell them, that's okay, we make mistakes. Here's what the answer is. Let's figure out where you went wrong. When young girls make mistakes on math, in order to comfort them, adults around them will say things like, that's okay. Girls just aren't good at math. And these messages, they come through. And there's a ton of reasons why. You said that there aren't a lot of tech hubs near historically Black communities. Well, why is that? It's because accretions of wealth happen by, systematic design outside of Black communities. Black communities are often barred from those accretions of community wealth. Not always, but generally, especially in America, where you and I both reside, that's how it is. That's how it's been. And so I think you're absolutely right that we can't just look at tech as is and say, well, you got to fix it. There are so many factors at play. And even though that's the case, it doesn't mean that we have to wait for fixes to be changed earlier in the pipeline. Yes, we can't
Yeah.
necessarily address the source necessarily because the source is vast, but tech is one of the reasons developers are paid so well is because tech is one of the surest means for companies to develop capital. And as tech workers, as developers, we are the drivers of that creation of capital, which is why we're paid so well, because we are a reliable source of capital for companies and for the economy. And that's why we're paid so well. One of my dearest friends is a social worker and makes basically poverty level money because that is not a source of capital. It's a crucial, necessary job. But because we live in a capitalist society, that work, that human level work, is not valued because it does not produce wealth for
Okay.
anyone else. So, sorry, I went off the lines.
No,
That's,
it's okay.
that's what I mean. Like,
I'm gonna
yeah,
just barb at you a little bit, you communist.
sure.
Um,
I
so
consider myself more of a socialist, if anything.
socialism is just one step to communism. Um, no, no, hear me out because I know that people are like, oh God, here we go. No, that's not the case. I will say, and I mean this with love,
Mhm.
your understanding of capitalism is narrow and naive. Capitalism is not the problem.
Oh no, I think
Capitalism is
toxic capitalism, unchecked capitalism is bad.
I so I recently saw a short, and you have a good point. Is that there is, and the comment was on toxic masculinity. There is, there's masculinity, and then there are toxic people, which may result in toxic masculinity. Same goes for capitalism.
Mhm.
People who do not invest, for example, as a social worker or a sociologist, in those fields are bad capitalists. Capitalism is not about the ultimate gain of wealth. It is a system, a mathematical system, in fact, of supply, demand, result. Okay. And hopefully you find an equilibrium where there is a holistic win. So what you've got is a government, and it doesn't matter which side we're talking about here.
Oh no, not at all.
We have a government who is invested in the GDP and direct profitable result of assets and resources, not of people. But I'll tell you what, remember when we went back to when we first started this conversation about how if we invest in people, there's, the curve is different. Those companies that take a moment and say, I have a team that's falling apart. Why? Well, I don't fucking know. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a health and wellness counselor. I'm not a psychologist. I don't know. I just know that they're doing this. The manager that steps back and says, wait a minute. Oh my God, there's experts in this field, and brings them in to solve that problem, especially if the team is willing to stop doing this for just a week and go like this, you will build a stronger team, a more connected team, a more intentional team, and guess what? A more profitable team. Capitalism has all of that available to it. The problem is the majority of the human race are assholes. They're selfish and they're assholes. What about me? Why should I pay for this? I shouldn't have to pay for your kid's daycare.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, fair. I'll make you a deal. Increase minimum wage to the point where it at least pegs inflation so that people can pay for daycare. You don't have to pay for it because capitalism allows for the increase of the minimum wage.
Capital, yeah.
Yeah, it's just over a spectrum of value, you will increase prices. And guess what? Since the buying power of the base level of society is higher, you're going to make more money. But people are too busy saying, well, I'm just going to pick on Jeff Bezos just because he's an easy target. He actually does a lot of charitable work that people don't know. They really don't. Amazon does a ridiculous amount of charity work. But where's my next yacht? Right? That's what people think of. And that's the problem, right? It's not, now, socialism isn't the answer. That doesn't mean that socialist policies do not have a place. I absolutely
Oh, for
agree
sure.
with that. Socialism and communism, I mean, just historically speaking, unless we can figure out how to fix people, which will never happen because that's a
People are
subjective
people.
statement. Yeah, it's subjective. Those always lead us down a path of wondering where the toilet paper is eventually. So yeah, I don't come at my capitalism.
Listen, here's my take. I understand the free market. I think where it falls apart, like you said, is because with all the breaks off, with corporations being afforded rights as individuals, whereas people are stripped of rights more and more and have less and less collective power to work against corporations, which have a lot of capital, you end up with situations where a few individuals can sequester the majority of wealth. And there are no breaks on that. There are very few checks on that. And you're just counting on someone to say, you know what, that's enough wealth. I think I don't need any more. Let's let it overflow into the next tier down. It's not realistic, and it was never designed to work the way that Reagan said that it would work. It was never meant to do that. It was meant to sequester wealth into smaller and smaller groups. Uh, so that's what I mean when I say capitalism. I'm not saying the structure of the system. It's similar to saying, I love science. Science as a system is self-correcting, but as an actual applied industry or field, it is susceptible to the same failures of greed, money, uh, confirmation bias. All of those things are there. It doesn't mean that science is bad. It just means that the live day-to-day application that we see in the system is flawed. And that's my criticism of capitalism. Maybe as a system, maybe as a means of measuring resources, demand, the market is not necessarily bad, but absolutely the version that we're living under, it's real gooey. It's not good in there.
Yeah, Kelsey Hightower. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a very well known. Okay, Kelsey Hightower is a very well known, very well respected African American in tech, and he is absurdly popular. He was a director of something at Google for many years,
Cool.
and he's talked about this off and on at this challenge. And I think what a lot of people forget, or not even forget, they don't even know that it actually doesn't take that much wealth to generate wealth.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that we're not with that particular statement is we do not teach young people that very thing. The
No.
value that we teach is you must have this bling. That's what we teach. We don't, uh, I once, when we first started offering our 401k for our employees, we had some employees who were like, I'm not going to, I don't know anything about this. I'm not going to contribute to this.
Oh.
And I said, so I'm not a financial advisor. Okay. I can't tell you what to do when it comes to this, but what I can do is give you a math problem. And since all my guys are DBAs and programmers and they love this. And I don't remember the exact number, but it was small. It was either $25 or $50 a month. Okay. And I said, look, if all you do is 50, I'll just use 50 because I don't remember the math in my head. $50 a month, which all of you can do, right? We're in tech. Just stop buying the damn lattes from Starbucks. Okay. $50 a month in tech in your 401k on a standard S&P return in 25 years, or I think it was 20 years, I said, is $75,000. You didn't do anything. You literally stopped watching Netflix for a month, every month, right? And that's the problem that I think a lot of people have is that you think of $100,000 as this, even as a lower income person, as this enormous amount of money, but it's not, and it is obtainable. Generally speaking, I know there are definite exceptions, especially in situations where you are making $7.25 an hour, which is the federal minimum wage, right? So I don't want to make light of that, but we are focused in tech here. If you're making minimum wage in tech, you're probably not that good at tech. I mean, nobody hires minimum wage in tech unless you're an intern, right? And even then, it's not $7.25; it's 20 or 15 or something an hour. As we start to roll up here, there's a couple of things I'd like to touch base on. And frankly, I think you and I need to, if you're willing, to have you on again, because we're touching on
Yeah, I'd love that.
we're having some great things here that we could expand on further. And I think we could learn a lot from each other. But there's a couple of topics here. Tech thinks that having a more diverse workforce is charity. What do you mean by that?
I guess I think a better phrasing would be that tech views DEI work, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, abolition work as a nice to have. It goes on the website. It's in our value statement. It shows up on, our careers page. Come work with us. This is what we value. But a lot of companies, when the chips are down, that's the work that gets prioritized at the bottom of the list. We got to just build features. We just got to do these things. Oh, that coach that we hired to help us identify the areas where we have bias in our systems and organizations, who are helping us point out areas where we can even do things like make our documentation more accessible. Well, that's nice. We'll get back to that when things are easier. It's viewed as not necessarily an integral and necessary part of the work, but as something that we get to when we have time and extra money to do. And so that's the viewpoint. That's what I mean by like, oh, look at this, what good work we're doing. Yay for us.
Well, I
And
don't
it's not
disagree
always,
with it.
yeah.
Well, it's a marketing term, right? DEI is a marketing term. It doesn't mean that there isn't good things behind the marketing term, but it's a marketing term. So people are going to latch onto it because that's what the masses are screaming about. But what do you mean outside of the obvious of documentation being potentially available to, say, the vision impaired? What is documentation? What's the barrier of entry there that you're discussing?
Maybe it doesn't exist. Maybe your team is built with senior devs in mind. Maybe you have this idea that your code truly is self-documenting. Bullshit.
Well,
No
I'll agree
code, no
with you. If
matter
you think
how
your
cleanly
code is
written.
self-documenting, you're a terrible developer. I mean, you may be a
So
genius at coming up with an algorithm, but you're a terrible developer.
yeah, right. So, and it's like things like that, junior, it's not to say that there are no senior developers who are from marginalized groups. That's definitely not true.
Right.
But I'd say it is true that a lot of junior devs coming up, it is a more diverse group coming up, which is great. If you don't make your documentation, your processes junior friendly, you're gonna just continue having the same, old guard. People who speak the same language, who have the same types of understanding and viewpoint, who approach code in the same way. Uh, yeah, I don't know. To me, that's a barrier. Using language, something that I have seen in my time as an instructor is so many tutorials out there use, classics like foobar as a variable name, just as a placeholder, just as a
Sure.
filler. Uh, Someone new to that who doesn't know the historical context of foobar, that's a barrier. It's just saying like, wait, what is this? Is it important to understand the concept that's being illustrated? No. So why did we make it harder? Why did we have to throw in a little in joke to make ourselves feel better? Why are all of these tutorials, these blog posts written explaining different algorithms using sports metaphors? Not everyone's into sports. Pop culture references, things like that, comic book references. For every one of those, you got to make sure that you have a reference about, I don't know, some other topic. Especially if your learning materials are intentionally designed for audiences who aren't like you. Uh, but I think a lot of times when we're writing documentation or writing tutorials, we're not thinking about that. We're writing it for our younger self who didn't understand a thing, which is not bad. That means there's a great diversity of documentation out there. But, uh, for boot camps, for universities, anyone teaching this technology and these ways of thinking, these types of problem solving skills, it's important to be cognitive of like who are you picturing as your student? Who are you picturing as the learner?
So, I
Yeah.
mean, that goes into communication theory. When you communicate for your audience. And most people aren't able to do that. They communicate from their viewpoint. All
Hmm.
right. I just had this conversation with our team here is that when you're having a problem, because since we're all remote, we're always chatting, right, in the chat box using Google Chat, and thank God not Teams or Slack.
Yeah.
Just terrible platforms. Not that Google Chat is that much better, but and there, I would call them out. I'm like, why is this taking so long? I'm like, well, blah 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 blah. I said, well, did you get on the goddamn phone? And I had to explain this basic communication theory about this and they were like, we didn't even think of getting on the phone. Are you freaking kidding me? However, your comment about metaphors, we do have to have a baseline, right? I'm not into sports, but I know how basketball works. I know how baseball works. I know how football works. Now, for me, a better metaphor is cars, right? But you do have to have some level of baseline that people can attach to. And there is no metaphor out there that I can think of that everyone's going to identify with,
Oh no, not at
or even
all. Which is
majority.
why for every, car metaphor, or for every time I teach how to write a JavaScript class and I use a car, an automobile or vehicle, and I talk about, inheriting from that class to create a bicycle or a car, and to add more and more detail in there. For every one of those, I should also have another version where we talk about, okay, our parent class is going to describe an organism. And then we'll break that down and we'll describe birds versus mammals, and we'll break that down and describe cats versus dogs. Uh, the thing is, I think the thing that I have found is that instruction is hard. Uh, it is hard to teach people how to code because it requires uh, the ability to teach in a diverse way to meet people's diverse learning styles, and to like read the room. And I think that applies directly to how we interact as team members, working on a product together. We have to be able to listen to each other in different ways. We have to be able to explain things in more than one way. We have to be able to document things clearly and have more than one pair of eyes on it. We love a code review. We love PRs. We love getting in there and commenting, but we don't do that for the installation instructions. We don't do that for our README. We don't do that for our wikis. One person writes the wiki and that's it.
Isn't there, so,
Yeah.
and let me be, I've been teaching for a long time. I think the first class I taught, I was 19 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So I do understand where you're coming from. And I also think that there's certainly a responsibility of the student.
Oh, for sure. But it's not on the student if you teach them in a way that their learning style has it's like sliding on glass. You have to build in scaffolding that the student can climb.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. When I say the responsibility of the student, the example that I would give is, let's talk about, you said organism, car. Although I don't think having two examples is overkill, I do think that the basis is the same. So the student should raise their hand and say, okay, Miss Professor, I have no fucking clue how baseball works. And you take 30 seconds to explain, 5 minutes to explain it. Baseball's not a complicated game. Or even cars. Cars are not that complicated. They got an engine, they got a transmission, they have brakes, they have tires, they have a vent. Okay, that's basically what a car is. And just explaining that builds up that scaffolding. And then on their own, they can take their notes and go, and now that we have almighty Google and very much,
ChatGPT,
or
go ask it.
Don't even start with, we don't have time to go into the copyright, trademark, intellectual property stealing ChatGPT. We'll do that another time. But we have the tools available to us.
I don't disagree. I agree. I think one of the pieces that's there is, what are you doing as the instructor to ensure that the classroom is a space where that student who doesn't understand cars, when everyone else around them totally gets the metaphor and is understanding the concept that's being illustrated by this metaphor, can raise their hand and feel like, I have the right to stop my class and make the teacher review this in a different way when all the rest of my classmates seem to get it and are ready to move on. What have you done to ensure the safety of that student and to make it clear that their misunderstanding is worth everyone's time? And that's a really crucial part that a lot of instructors don't know how to do.
I agree with you 100%. And that actually goes back to DEI. Although I will say that I think that DEI as an acronym is wrong, because we already have diversity. Diversity everywhere. We have women, men, different genders, Asians, whites, Hispanics, half and half, whatever. It's everywhere. What we don't have is inclusion. And what you're talking about is inclusion. When you make inclusion a priority, you automatically get diversity. And when you have inclusion, which creates diversity, you get equity. And that's really what you're talking about here when you're talking about teachers and teaching these students and helping them learn, is creating a welcome, thus inclusive, environment to be curious, not always have the answer, problem solve, and build their knowledge, regardless of their background.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, what's most important, and this might bug you, but that's okay because we're wrapping up, so you can cuss at me after. Is that the teachers need to remember that they work for the students.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I'm not even talking about professional students. If you are a professor and you do not recognize that your job exists because someone is sitting in your room paying a ridiculous amount of money, because you likely couldn't cut it in the private sector anyway, your job is to make sure that they feel welcome, included, and learning, even if that means you need to stop the class and extend the lecture or see them after class if it's not, whatever. And my favorite and I invite you to look this guy up. He's on YouTube. I don't remember his name, and I invite everybody. It is soc119.org. This is a sociology professor who publishes almost all of his lectures, workshops, all with his students online in YouTube. And I think, Leta, you will actually really like this guy because although he is a self-prescribed, I am a liberal, but he'll also stand up and say, and this is what's wrong with all of us, right? And he explains it from a scientific studied perspective, not from a, well, I feel this and therefore. No, we need to back it up and have the basis of structure and infrastructure. And with that, this has been More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Our guest today was Leta Keane.
Kane, you got it.
And Leta, we'll make sure and have our producer put your LinkedIn profile on like something on the video or something, because I do believe that although you're a little bit of a commie, I'm okay with that. I think that you would add absolute value to any organization. And I would invite you to consider maybe not being an engineer, but being a peer advocate, a facilitator of communication between diverse teams, that kind of thing. Because the value that you bring, and when I look at this holistically, is that you understand these core principles and the problems that they are, and can kind of bridge that divide between old guard, new guard, different cultures. And I think that makes you more valuable from a paycheck perspective than how many lines of code you can accurately write.
Awesome. Thank you. It's
You,
been so great being on here and getting to chat with you and do a little bit of like light, loving arguing. And I would love to be back. It's been really great talking with you, JD.
thank you.